afternoon, sir. Can you please introduce yourself to the court?
Hi, my name is Patrick Sebastian Sikorsky.
Mr. Sikorsky, what do you do for a living?
Well, I'm the director of the crime lab for the Midlands Department of Criminal Investigation. My office handles all of the forensic investigations in Midlands.
Well, how long have you been the director of that lab?
For 5 years. Prior to that, I was a criminalist for the previous 10.
Mr. Sikorsky, were you asked to do any investigation in this bribery case?
Yes. The Midlands State Police Department contacted me. The lead investigator in this case wanted us to review a piece of physical evidence.
What piece of evidence did the investigators ask you to review?
It was a briefcase recovered from Chase Covington upon his arrest on April 19th.
All right, well, before we talk about that briefcase, I want to talk about your background. Where'd you go to school?
I received my bachelor's degree in chemistry from Marshall University and dual PhDs in chemistry and biology from Washington University in St. Louis.
Have you done any research in the fields of forensic investigation?
Yes, I'm actually an adjunct faculty member at Midland State University. And as part of that, I've authored 28 peer-reviewed journal articles relating to the practice of forensic science, the collection and analysis of physical evidence.
I want to talk about your investigation now, Doctor. Would you recognize that briefcase you said you analyzed if I showed it to you today?
Yes, I would.
Your Honor, let the record reflect I'm approaching the witness with prosecution 1.
Okay.
Mr. Sikorsky, do you recognize what I just showed you?
Yes, that is the briefcase that I analyzed for this case.
At this time, Your Honor, we move prosecution 1 as evidence.
Any objection?
No objection, Your Honor.
Hearing none.
Now, when you were analyzing this briefcase, Mr. Sikorsky, what were you looking for?
Well, it's like I tell my students at Midland State. When analyzing forensic evidence, the smallest piece of evidence, fingerprints, hair, chemical stains, blood, they can tell a big story. So I was looking for anything like that.
But when you analyzed this briefcase, what'd you do first?
Oh, I began by dusting it for fingerprints.
Did you find any fingerprints on this briefcase?
Yes, I did. I found 6.
Would you be able to show the members of the jury where on this briefcase you found those fingerprints?
Yes, of course.
Your Honor, permission for the witness to step down?
Permission granted.
Mr. Sikorsky, I just want you to begin by telling the members of the jury exactly where these 6 fingerprints were located.
Well, of course. So there were 3 fingerprints that were found on the handle of the briefcase.
Objection to lack of foundation, Your Honor, may be heard.
Sure.
They have not gone into the method used to find these fingerprints, and for that matter, pursuant to...
Okay, I'll sustain right there. Let's do like a perfect foundation for that.
Yes, Your Honor.
And then we can move on to your next issue at that point.
A motion is correct, any testimony authority been elicited.
Well, I don't think anything's happened here, so let's go ahead.
Mr. Sikorsky, you testified that you found 6 fingerprints on this briefcase. How did you locate those fingerprints?
Well, I dusted the briefcase with a magnetic powder. It sticks to the fingerprints that were left on the briefcase.
And is this standard practice in your field to use that magnetic powder?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
So can you tell us, after you applied that magnetic powder, where you found those fingerprints on the briefcase?
Yes, well, I found 3 fingerprints on the handle, 1 print on either side of the briefcase's lid, and then 1 fingerprint on the right latch, the mechanism to open the briefcase.
Were you able to determine who those fingerprints belonged to?
Yes, I was.
And how did you go about doing that?
Well, I cross-referenced the fingerprints that I found on the briefcase with samples collected from individuals. In this case, Chase Covington, Avery Bancroft, and Tracy Minetos, who lives in Mr. Covington's home.
Well, how were you able to determine if these samples matched the fingerprints on the briefcase?
Well, we used a points of comparison test, basically putting up the fingerprints side by side and using a computer algorithm, find the number of points of match between the fingerprints on the briefcase and the samples that I had collected from the individuals.
Did all of the fingerprints you collect from that briefcase meet that 16-point standard?
Yes, so there is a 16-point standard for points of comparison, and all of the fingerprints on this briefcase did meet that standard.
Objection to lack of foundation, Your Honor, may be heard.
Sure.
I'd like to refer you to Terriers Association of Midland versus Merrill Dow. And in that case law, it states that for an expert to testify to a method they use, they first must lay the foundation that that method has been peer reviewed and that has been subject to rigorous testing. They have not done any foundation as to the reputation of the method they use to find those fingerprints.
I'll sustain that objection. I'm sure Counselor can lay that foundation for us once you do that now.
Sir,
Motion is right, Your Honor.
Well, it's just, but why don't we just leave the record as it is, subject to the laying of the foundation that you're asking for?
Your Honor, may I ask for clarification?
Yeah.
Is this foundation as to the reliability of the principles and methods he used when collecting the fingerprints?
That's my understanding of the objection.
Yes, Your Honor. So, Mr. Skorsky, can you tell us whether or not that 16-point standard you use is a reliable method for comparing fingerprints in a case like this one?
Yes, the points of comparison method is the most widely used and widely respected method in Midlands for doing fingerprint testing. Additionally, just to confirm the matches that I made, I had another criminalist who works in our office double check my work just to make sure there weren't any mistakes.
Okay, so you were mentioning that you compared these fingerprints to the samples and that they met this points of similarity match. Who did you determine those 6 fingerprints belonged to?
Well, starting with just the fingerprints on the handle, I found that 2 of them belonged to Chase Covington and the 3rd belonged to Avery Bancroft.
Sir, could you do me a favor and mark those fingerprints with these color codes that I'm giving to the witness?
Oh yes, of course.
And Your Honor, let the record reflect that Mr. Skorsky will be marking Chase Covington's fingerprints with the pink circles, and the record will reflect, may the record reflect also that he's marking the briefcase where Avery Bancroft's fingerprints were with the yellow circles.
Okay, so noted.
So now that we've talked about the fingerprints on the handle, I want to move on and talk about the fingerprints on the side of the briefcase. Who did those belong to?
Both of them actually belong to Avery Bancroft. So the fingerprint on the right side of the lid was a match for Avery Bancroft's right index finger. And the one on the left side of the lid was a match for her left index finger.
I want to talk about that 3rd location, the latch used to open the briefcase. Who did that fingerprint belong to?
That also belonged to Avery Bancroft. This one was for her right thumb.
Take those stickers back. There you go. Now, Mr. Skorsky, besides the fingerprints you found on the outside of the briefcase recovered from the defendant, was there any other evidence on this?
Yes, there was. So the rest of the evidence was actually inside of the briefcase. So the first thing I noticed when looking at the inside of the briefcase was this sort of stain that you can see on the fabric there. So I did a chemical comparison test on that stain.
Can you explain a little bit more about how that chemical comparison works?
Yes, so the test that we use is called GCMS. Basically, it serves as a big filter. So I vaporized this stain, which just basically got the stain out of the fabric, then ran it through this GCMS, and that filters out all the different chemicals that were in that stain. Then each of those molecules is weighed to determine what it is. Essentially what you're left with is a list of ingredients of the things that were in the chemical that made that stain.
And how reliable is this GCMS test you conducted on that stain in the briefcase?
Well, it's passed peer review hundreds of times, so it's fairly reliable.
So after running that analysis on that stain in the briefcase the defendant had when it was recovered, what were you able to determine that stain was?
Well, I found that it shared similar characteristics to perfume or cologne. So I had the Midland State Police search the homes of Chase Covington and Avery Bancroft for any perfume samples. I then ran those through GCMS as well to compare the stain to each of those samples.
Before we talk about what that comparison revealed, can you tell us, these kind of comparison using this test, how reliable is that?
This sort of comparison comes with a 95% confidence level.
So when you compared that stain inside the briefcase the defendant had when he was arrested, this perfume didn't match?
It matched a sample recovered from Avery Bancroft's home. It was a rare fragrance called La Nuit de Warren.
Thank you, sir. You can retake your seat. Mr. Skorsky, besides the fingerprints on the outside of this briefcase and that chemical stain on the inside, did you collect any other evidence from that briefcase the defendant had?
Yes, so also on the inside of the briefcase, I found 5 strands of hair that I tested.
How did you test those 5 hairs you found?
Using DNA comparison.
Tell us a little bit about this DNA comparison you conducted.
Sure. Well, I began by extracting the DNA from the hairs that I found inside the briefcase. I then ran that against DNA samples provided to me once again by Chase Covington, Avery Bancroft, and Tracy Meadows.
Well, how reliable, Mr. Skorsky, is a DNA comparison?
Well, every person's DNA is unique, except for identical twins. So if a person's DNA profile matches standard collected, in this case, from the briefcase, it's almost certain that the person actually left that DNA there.
Did all 5 of those hairs match the same person?
Yes, they did.
Objection, like the foundation, Your Honor, may be heard.
Sure.
They've said that the witness lifted DNA from this briefcase, but they have not said what test was used, and they have not testified as to whether the test was reliable.
I'll sustain that objection until such foundation is laid.
Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Skorsky, can you tell the members of the jury how you got that DNA out of those hair samples you collected?
Yes, well, first I put them in chloroform solution and then centrifuged the sample. That essentially broke up the hair and separated out each of the components by their mass. Then I, from that, extracted the DNA and replicated it, because normally in like 5 strands of hair there wouldn't be enough DNA to actually do a comparison. So I replicated that DNA using a polymerase chain reaction, then ran it against the DNA samples collected from the defendant and Avery Bancroft and Tracy Meadows using gel electrophoresis.
Mr. Skorsky, that's a lot of information, so I'm just going to ask you, how reliable is that kind of DNA extraction when you're analyzing DNA in a case like this one?
Oh, incredibly reliable. It's been admitted in courtrooms all throughout America, and like I said, every person's DNA profile is unique.
All right, so did all 5 of those hairs have the same DNA?
Yes, they did.
And when you compared those 5 hairs inside the briefcase the defendant was arrested with, who do those 5 hairs belong to?
They belong to Avery Bancroft.
Thank you, sir. Your Honor, I have no further questions.
Cross.
Yes, Your Honor.